specialist by accident. I went to graduate school, and gives me away, but the video probably gives me away, in 1979, which was a few months after the Sandinistas had taken power. And I went to study Mexico. I was interested in Mexico and realized quickly that there wasn't really very much funding to go to Mexico. I was interested in Maya issues and that sort of thing. And so there was money available to go to Guatemala. And I thought, well, that's a Maya area too. And so went there for the first time in the summer of 1980. Central America had been in the news a lot the whole time that I had been in graduate school. And I just fell in love with it. You know, they say in Guatemala that you don't choose it, it chooses you, and it chose me right away. And you know, all these years later, I've continued to go back and have lived there and continue to be engaged with it. So. There wasn't any particular grand plan to make UT a place to study Central America. In fact, when I came here to UT in 1990, it was very strong on anthropology because of the presence of people who had been here for a long time, like Richard Adams, that a surprising number of people ended up sort of gravitating in for various reasons, many of whom worked on Central America. For example, Charlie Hale, current director of LLILAS, I think really came to UT not because it was strong on Central America, but because he was in some ways replacing Rick when Rick retired. It's not that direct a line, but in some ways that's what was going on. But Charlie had been working in Nicaragua. He'd already published about Nicaragua. He had interest in Guatemala. And so eventually there was this critical mass of people who sort of informally created a group and an interest. And around that, the BENSON Latin American collection was very good about building up collections around our interests. There was already one collection that Rick had acquired, Rick Adams, which was the Tata Santa Flores collection, which is materials from the Guatemala 1944-54 10 Years of Spring. A very nice collection of materials about that. But that's pretty much all we had Central American-wise. The strengths of the library have always been Mexico, really. I mean, it's got other strengths too, but Mexico has been, you know, the centerpiece of the BENSON Latin American collection. But then we were able to acquire the Carpio Nicole collection, which is more contemporary materials on Guatemala. And little by little, Rick Adams left all of his field notes. And he's a very, very distinguished anthropologist, left all of his field notes to the BENSON. And so little by little, the collection began to grow and acquire a coherence that it hadn't had before. And that coalesced with some other impulses and initiatives that were taking place around the university. For example, the Rappaport Human Rights Center is a huge factor in that. And people who became involved with the Rappaport Center also began to think about donating their materials to the BENSON. Of course, there's the material in Chile that's very powerful stuff. But in terms of Central America, for example, Jennifer Harbury, who was a very prominent activist in the late 80s and 90s, will donate her materials there. I think the jewel in the crown at this point, and it comes out of those initiatives through the Rappaport Human Rights Center, is the Archives of the National Police of Guatemala. And that's just an amazing non-custodial collection, meaning it's a digital copy of documents that were found in Guatemala. Gosh, when was it? I think it was maybe 1995 now. It's longer than it seems like it was. But nobody had any idea these documents from the National Police were there. They go back to 1896, although most of the ones that have been digitalized thus far from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, because that's what people are most interested in. And in terms of human rights work, you can still prosecute legal cases and resolve disappearances for living families, and so it's important to get those things digitalized quickly. But the way that works is the actual archive is still in Guatemala, and people use it in Guatemala, but we are little by little, or lot by lot, because when they send it up, they send up huge sections of it. We're acquiring a complete digital collection of all the documents in that. And the purpose of that is twofold. One is to make the documents available outside of Guatemala, but the other is to safeguard them just in case somebody were to throw a match into that archive in Guatemala City or something else, just shut it down. Means you can't shut it down, it's here. And so symbolically it's really important, but also just as a resource it's incredibly important. So that's certainly one of the most exciting things that's happened in years. Okay, the conference we're holding in February is called Archiving the Central American Revolutions. And it started off with a very modest idea that people who were involved in some way or another to greater or lesser extent are my age and older. And people are beginning to think, what am I going to do with all this stuff that I collected? And when I say people who were involved, our original thinking was that we were hoping that the BENSON would become a repository for sort of ordinary people's materials that they had collected. I was very struck about 3 or 4 years ago, Fernando Cardenal, who was one of the priests who had been involved in the Sandinista insurrection and then became part of the directorate and head of the literacy campaign, was visiting, and he came to the BENSON, and we have a lot of materials from the literacy campaign, the Nicaraguan literacy campaign, because someone who works in the library had been involved with it. And so she had decided, I don't want this in my house, I'm going to donate it to the BENSON. And being a librarian, she would think of that. He literally had tears come into his eyes when he saw these materials because they don't exist in Nicaragua anymore. Subsequent governments have gotten rid of all the didactic materials and the posters and all this material stuff that had been part of that literacy campaign, which was something he was enormously and justifiably very proud of, but that historical record had been lost, except it was here. And so, out of that germ, I'm not the one who originated it, but people began to think this is a moment where people who have this stuff sitting in their garage or in some old file cabinet, they may throw it away. And it's better that it come to a place where it can be used. I think people don't understand how materials that they own and that were once an active part of their everyday life can become a historical material. But it can. And so the original idea for the conference was just to bring together largely sort of old solidarity. When I say old, I don't mean old, mind you, but former solidarity workers and people who had been, what P.J. O'Rourke sort of derisively, but I love the name, used to call sandinistas, sort of Birkenstock-wearing people who had gone down to help the Sandinista youth pick coffee and that sort of thing. So anyway, but it grew from there, and so the conference it still has that component to it, but it's sort of grown into the idea that we want to use a lens of history to look at this period of time, mainly the late 70s and early 1980s in Central America, and how people's participation, and at this point we don't just mean solidarity workers, but we mean journalists and priests, but also guerrilla commanders and people who were in charge of the Nicaraguan medical program, people who were prominent actors as opposed to really kind of peripheral actors. We want to include all of them, how things look different to them now. How the lens of history sort of helps you to understand that period of time. And in tandem with that, we hope they'll give us their stuff. Because we really would like this to be a place where when people want to study the Central American revolutions, this would be a place where they can come and do that in a really substantive way. So that's what the conference is about. The reason that there were a lot of American solidarity workers who went to Central America is because they were opposed to U.S. policy and wanted to sort of live out that opposition in a very tangible way. I think it also had something to do with the fact that Central America is close. It is Spanish speaking, it's not Arabic speaking, and so people could go down there, young people could go down there really not very well prepared for what they were going to do. A couple of years of high school Spanish, thinking that that was going to be enough, but it was a place for, if you're just talking about solidarity people, for young idealists to go. One of the things that's really struck me as we organized this conference is even the journalists who went, and I was aware of this to some degree because I married one of them, but they were really young. I mean, these were people who were just fresh out of college. When Mark Danner and Ray Bonner sort of discovered the El Mozote massacre, which was a massacre that took place, Salvadoran military killed 800 people in a village, and then denied it, and it ended up being a scandalous massacre. They were 25 years old when they dug this out, and that's one of the things that makes the conference interesting is some of the principles in it. People who were really, leading revolutionary movements or were liberation theology priests. Some of them are genuinely elderly, and some of the people that we would have liked to have come in are alive, but they're just in too fragile health to travel. But then other people are in their 50s. They're not ancient people, but they've certainly had enough time to reflect on it. But it really does strike me, and I know when Fernando Cardenal was here, someone said to him, he was talking about the Ortega government today, which has gone in a completely different direction, and old Sandinistas feel like he has completely betrayed the values of the original Sandinista revolution, even though he calls himself a Sandinista today. And somebody said, "Oh, you must be depressed," to Fernando Cardenal, who led the literacy campaign. And he said, "No." He said, "I could never be depressed because I watched young people overthrow a dictatorship." It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I know.